As a matter of first importance, it is required to clarify the meaning of Romanticism. Romanticism has been the subject of hot controversy among the critics of the world. Nobody has had the ability to present a suitable meaning of the term Romanticism. Romanticism was a literary and intellectual movement in Europe that started in the late decades of 18th century. It was with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 by William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, which gave birth to Romanticism in the history of English literature. Kazemian defines Romanticism in A History of English Literature as, the romantic spirit can be defined as an accentuated predominance of emotional life, provoked or directed by the exercise of imaginative vision, and in its turn stimulating or directing such exercise. Some critics considered Romanticism as Renaissance of wonder. Whatever the case may be, it is evident that Romanticism came into being as a reaction against the neoclassicism of the preceding age. Romantic poetry is a type of poetry which exhibits such features as emotion, imagination, escapism, supernaturalism, Hellenism, medievalism, love for nature, etc. Now, let's move ahead and discuss the salient features of Romantic poetry. Romantic poetry carries unique features, which definitely distinguish it from other kinds of poetry. It is absolutely in contrast to neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poetry is poetry of intellect and reason, while Romantic poetry is the product of emotions, sentiments and the voice of the heart of the poet. Romantic poetry is what the heart of the poet says. It is a catharsis of the poet's emotions, thoughts, feelings and ideas bound in his heart. Romantic poetry is a reaction against the set standards, conventions, rules and traditional laws of poetry. That is the reason Romantic poetry is acknowledged as poetry of progressivism in contrast to neoclassical poetry. According to William J. Long, the Romantic movement was marked, and is always marked, by a strong reaction and protest against the bondage of rule and custom which in science and theology as well as literature, generally tend to fetter the free human spirit. The Romantics were against the influence of reason in their poetry. They didn't give any preference to reason and intellect in their poetry. On the other hand, neoclassical poets believed in the influence of reason. Pope said that, true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. Imagination is the hallmark of Romantic poetry. It is a part and parcel of Romantic poets like John Keats, Samuel Coleridge and P.B. Shelley. Unlike neoclassical poets, who shunned imagination and didn't give any preference to imagination in their poetry, Romantic poets laid extraordinary stress on imagination. They discredited the influence of reason and intellect in any form in their poetry. Samuel Coleridge considered an integral part of his poetry. In his Biographia Literaria, he has discussed two types of imagination: primary and secondary imagination. He says, "The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and a repetition in the finite of the external act of creation of the infinite I am. The secondary I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree, and in the mode its operation." John Keats was a great supporter of imagination in poetry. He says, "I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth." It is Keats's plight of imagination that helps him leave the real world and transport him into the world of Nightingale. Look at the following example: "Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays, but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways." Love for nature is another important feature of Romantic poetry. Nature had a pivotal position in their poetry. Nature for them is a wellspring of inspiration, satisfaction and happiness. It is pertinent to mention here that all the Romantic poets differed in their views about nature. Wordsworth is considered the great lover of nature. Wordsworth recognized nature as a living thing, teacher, God and everything. He was the true adorer of nature. He says, "One impulse from the vernal wood can teach you more of man, of moral, evil and good, than all the sages can." Shelley was similarly an extraordinary lover of nature, yet he didn't think about nature as an instructor, aid and a wellspring of pleasure. He believed that nature is a living thing and there is a union between nature and man. Shelley likewise put stock in the recuperating force of nature like Wordsworth. Wordsworth gives a philosophical touch to nature, while Shelley stays upon the intellectual aspect of nature. John Keats is also an eminent lover of nature. John Keats didn't love nature just for the sake of guidance or spiritual inspiration, rather, he adored nature just for the sake of its sensuousness and beauty. Keats enjoyed nature in its full essence. He says, "There was an awful rainbow once in heaven, we know here woof, texture she is given, in the dull catalogue common things." Coleridge was completely different from other romantic poets of his age. He considered nature as it is. He has a realistic perspective of nature. He believes that nature is not the source of joy and pleasure. It all depends upon our mood and disposition. He is of the opinion that joy doesn't come from any external nature, rather, it emanates from the heart of our hearts. He says in this regard, "I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life, whose fountains are within. O Lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live, ours is her wedding garment, ours her shroud." Escapism is another striking characteristic of Romantic poetry. Escapism is a term which implies a writer's failure to face the agonies of real life and take shelter somewhere else instead of fighting against the odds. Escapism is the main theme of Romantic poetry. As most of the Romantic poets were in the grip of miseries, they tried to take asylum in the bower of their poetry. It was their most loved pastime to escape from reality and take asylum in the realm of their imagination. For example, Keats desires to fly away with the nightingale to forget the miseries of the world. "Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy." Melancholy likewise occupies a prominent place in Romantic poetry. Melancholy is a major source of inspiration for the Romantic poets. Due to extreme melancholy, all the Romantic poets have a tendency to compose subjective poetry. They write poetry, which is the voice of the heart of their heart. They don't try to compose philosophical and complicated poetry. They just want to give vent to their feelings and emotions so that to ease their minds. They want to take a load of their minds. Look at the following example: "For many a time, I have been half in love with his full death, called him soft names in many amused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath, now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain." Medievalism is likewise an important characteristic of Romantic poetry. Medievalism means one's love for the Middle Ages. Romantic poetry is replete with elements of medievalism a great deal. John Keats and Coleridge are the leading Romantic poets, whose poetry exhibited an ample amount of medievalism. Romantic poets were against intellectualism, urbanism, industrialization and humdrum life. They wanted to get rid of these things by taking asylum in far-off lands of their imagination. That is why Middle Ages appealed to their taste to a great extent. They adored weird, remote and recondite places. Resultantly, they were more attracted to Middle Ages than to their own age. Look at the following example: "Oh, what can ail thee, night at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing." Hellenism implies love, commitment and unmistakable fascination in the antiquated society, values and individuals of Greek. Romantic poets loved Hellenism a great deal in their poetry. They loved to explore the ancient culture of Greek in their poetry. John Keats' poetry is loaded with various allusions to the art, literature and culture of Greek. Ode on a Grecian urn is a perfect example in this regard. The pictures engraved on the Grecian urn show Keats's love of Greek ideals, culture and art. Look at the following example. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of its folk, this pious morn? Supernaturalism is another important feature of Romantic poetry. Most of the Romantic poets used supernatural elements in their poetry. Supernaturalism is a unique trait of Romantic poets. They used supernaturalism not just for the creation of horror and awe, rather, they used it for the pleasure of the reader. Samuel Coleridge is the leading Romantic poet in this regard. His poem, Kubla Khan, is the most romantic poem in the history of English literature. It is completely the product of his imagination. The whole poem is a collection of supernatural elements. Look at the following example, and all should cry, beware, beware. His flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close eyes with holy dread for him on honey, Drew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Romantic poetry is poetry of the miseries, despairs and personal stories of the poets. It is poetry of sentiments, emotions and imagination of the poets. Romantic poetry is against the objectivity of neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets avoided to describe their personal emotions in their poetry. They wanted to present a true picture of the society, while the Romantic poets avoided description of their contemporary age. John Keats is the leading poet, whose poetry is a biography of his life. He wrote poetry just for the sake of poetry. He didn't want to convey any moral message to his readers. He just wanted to write poetry and prove himself the best poet in his age. That is why we find numerous clues to his personal life in his poems. Look at the following example. Or many a time, I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many amused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain. Thanks for watching.